From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. With just over an hour's warning, Westminster was put on notice. Nigel Farage would be making a speech about his political future.
I have to say, the last 2 years, I've really enjoyed the job of being an MP. The people, the constituency, it's an office that I genuinely adore.
The leader of Reform, who had been accused of avoiding interviews for weeks, was now addressing the country's media without having to answer any awkward questions about his finances.
It seems to me that the establishment have now decided that they can't beat us fairly, so they've chosen to use foul means. Let me be absolutely clear. After the furore and the media pile-on, well, not just the media, the other political parties too, let me be absolutely clear. I have done nothing wrong.
Farage, a seasoned political bruiser, has appeared rattled since the revelations of a £5 million gift from a crypto billionaire led to a parliamentary standards investigation. And then came the revelations over the weekend.
Now, Standards investigating me over the gift has now reared its head again as a result of a lot of copy in this week's Sunday Times.
We'll hear from Gabriel Pogrund, the editor of Insight, the team behind the Sunday Times investigation. Why are we so worried about a crypto tycoon and a convicted fraudster, both of whom live abroad, funding a British politician?
These are men who've gone off as entrepreneurs around the world and succeeded. The sort of people we used to admire over centuries. Now government ministers refer to them in Parliament as malign actors. Frankly, it is like living in a communist country.
With his broadsides against the media and the establishment, Nigel Farage insisted it was the people who should decide his fate.
I will resign as a member of Parliament for Clacton-on-Sea, thereby forcing a by-election, which would happen, I hope, in short order. No, I've decided that the people of Clacton should be the judges of my actions. This will be a people versus the establishment by-election.
As we hurtle towards another by-election, this time in Clacton, will Farage prove that he's still backed by the people? And what happens to the parliamentary standards investigations into him now that he's resigned? The Story today. Farage resigns. What next?
I'm Gabriel Pogrund, editor of Insight, the Sunday Times investigations team.
Very much man of the moment. Your investigation has had a huge impact. I mean, we're speaking on Tuesday afternoon. Earlier today, there was just a moment where there was a collective gasp across the newsroom when the news dropped that Nigel Farage was going to be making an announcement about his future. Where were you when that happened, and what did you think?
Well, I was with my colleagues Emmanuel Modolo and Venetia Mingus, who, alongside the great George Greenwood at the Times, I did this report with, and we were a total team throughout. And it's one of those stories where we spent 5,000 words attempting to condense the sum total of some serious investigation that took us from Mayfair to Montenegro. And we never had any notion of what the impact might be. And I think in some ways, as a journalist, you don't really want to look for impact because it's not about getting any result. You just want the words to be accurate and for them to hopefully collectively serve the public interest. So I suppose it was just a case of kind of incredulity at the instantaneousness and extent of the impact.
And Gabriel, for anyone who has missed the podcast and hasn't caught up with the story, just remind us of the headlines.
So we reported on Sunday that Nigel Farage had failed to declare benefits received from George Cottrell, a convicted criminal, an aristocrat who spent months in prison in the United States for his role in a dark web money laundering conspiracy. We said that Farage appeared to have broken parliamentary rules which require all benefits that are not purely personal to be divulged within 12 months of an MP's election. And we also followed the trail of George Cottrell from Mayfair to Montenegro, where he now has a penthouse, and examined his involvement in a crypto gambling platform implicated in potential criminal wrongdoing.
I mean, it was extraordinary. It's with about 48 hours after the story breaks, and you've got headlines in the Sunday Times. There's a podcast. In fact, there's an entire series that, if you haven't heard it, please do. It's called Posh George. This is an extraordinary outcome. Clearly, Nigel Farage does seem to be rattled. When he gave his speech, we were all watching very closely. Just remind us of what he said. What is his version of where things stand?
Well, he is extremely angry. He is angry at the media. He's angry at Labour. He's angry at the Conservatives. He was incandescent about what he claimed was media intrusion into the life of his family.
I will not tolerate intimidation of my family. I will not tolerate the location of where they live being revealed. I will not tolerate any of my family being endangered because of what I choose to do in public life. So yes, you can ask, am I angry? But I've never been angrier in my life.
But more pertinently, he was full of righteous indignation about what he claimed was the premise underpinning some of the reporting that we, among others, have done, which is this idea that it isn't acceptable in British public life to have made any money or to make any money.
Now, it would seem from the last couple of years, from the way I've been treated, that the press would rather our members of Parliament had no assets and no wealth at all. They seem to fundamentally object to any MP that has outside income. Indeed, they view those that have continuing business interests with severe scepticism. Making money is not a crime.
And I suppose I can only say that the reality is we just put some information into the public domain to which he didn't have straightforward or necessarily adequate answers from a political perspective. And I think that was probably the same in relation to the 5 million.
Reform UK's leader, Nigel Farage, said today he didn't have to declare that 5 million quid given to him by Thailand-based crypto billionaire Christopher Harborne because it was a private gift to fund his personal security.
Which preceded our story, but which alongside it, you'd have to say was the reason for today's announcement. And it's a kind of fascinating situation because he acknowledged that our reporting on George Cottrell had led to a new investigation by the Standards Commissioner, or he said as much. I've not independently verified that myself since. But I suppose at the heart of it, he didn't actually mention the allegations themselves. He didn't say, here's why it's wrong, or here's a itemized list of my objections to the facts. He's deciding to characterise the disclosure of these facts as part of some anti-wealth, anti-reform establishment agenda. So that's his position, and his hope is that he can use that to pulverise Labour and the Tories and reassert his political authority. How that works and how that interacts with both political reality but also the reality of the rules of the Palace of Westminster is now of the essence politically. Those are going to be the determinative questions over the next few months.
Yeah, I mean, he was adamant that he had done nothing wrong. Obviously, there is a parliamentary standards inquiry that has been underway, which would actually establish if that was true or not. That's now on hold. As you say, what we hadn't known before was that there was now going to be a second inquiry based on your story, based on that investigation. And for him, we've seen him looking quite rattled and uncomfortable in interviews, avoiding interviews over the last few weeks with one parliamentary inquiry. Now with this one, it seems to have sort of been the tipping point for him. This is all getting very uncomfortable. Do you think it's just that as somebody who's been in politics for such a long time but not in Parliament, he's not really used to scrutiny or accountability?
Well, it is true that clearly our report was what changed the conversation for him, because he was on his way back from America where he'd seen J.D. Vance last week and was approached by a Sky News reporter who asked him whether he should have declared the funds from George Cottrell, and he was seething.
Is it a mistake not to declare the gifts from George Cottrell, sir?
You tell your bosses you harass my family anymore, and I'll take you for serious consequences. That's what your organisation has done this morning. Go away.
Was it a mistake not to declare the gifts, sir?
Did you not hear me?
And by the way, I'm not saying he was angry as a dig at him. He himself repeatedly said today that he is angry, angrier than he's ever been, he said, if I am recalling correctly. Why has he responded to this in this way? I suppose an important principle of journalism is not to attempt to insert oneself into another person's innermost thoughts. If I can just say one factual dimension of this, it's that the story itself has never been disputed. Reform UK's own Treasury spokesman Robert Jenrick on Sunday toured the broadcast rounds, in which, no doubt very unhappily, he nevertheless did stand up the core claims that we reported, among them that Cottrell paid for Farage's staff, security, drivers, that he had provided a house which Farage had stayed in repeatedly, and that George Cottrell himself is involved with a crypto gambling platform implicated in criminal wrongdoing. So those are the bits that are quite difficult to address directly. And of course, he has this relationship of profound depth, this deep personal, emotional, political bond with George Cottrell, for which reason the idea that he would ever come out and provide a full technicolor commentary on the inside of their relationship seems unlikely. It might, in this instance, have been easier to just put a big circle around all of it, group together all these acts of intrusion or media hostility as he perceives it, and just say, I'm drawing a line under it, and I'll let the public have their say.
It is an extraordinary story, and it does seem to have had an instant impact across Westminster. As you say, Reform, through some of the interviews they've done since, do seem to have confirmed many of the basic facts of the story. How did Nigel Farage respond?
So Farage was conspicuous by his absence on Saturday and Sunday and on Monday. So the story broke on Saturday. I believe he gave a comment to the Daily Express claiming that he was considering legal action against the Sunday Times. But other than that, he sort of withheld comment until today. And what he said today was that we were part of this wider plot, this establishment plot, and that we had an animus against him, that I had an animus against him, and that there were inaccuracies in the reporting. So he didn't specify what any of those were, but that was his position.
And what about George Cottrell? For his part, what was his response?
Well, Posh George has a Twitter account which hasn't posted of late. The primary way to communicate with him at this moment is through his lawyers at Carter Ruck. And they gave us a fair amount of information over the course of the weekend, setting out his position on the allegations. I suppose the notion of rule-breaking, parliamentary rule-breaking, wasn't one for him. He did acknowledge paying for Farage's security as recently as Q1 2024. The lawyers provided a statement saying that he had made transfers from a bank account held, or from bank accounts held in his name to members of Farage's staff. And he said that he was not aware of any of the potentially criminal conduct that we examined connected to the gambling firm he's involved in.
Now, in his big statement, Nigel Farage, while saying this is all part of a conspiracy by the establishment, does seem to say that, his finances and, the finances of people who are doing well are really none of our business. Why do you think there is a public interest in looking at where he's been getting his money from?
I think that the public interest in this, from my perspective, is visible from outer space. The objective of journalism, especially investigative journalism, is to examine the extent to which a powerful person's interests may interact with their public role. And that, by the way, is also the role of the MP's Code of Conduct. Its language is very clear. It's about upholding democracy by having a high level of transparency that means that any reasonable person could be satisfied both what an MP's interests are, but also whether those interests might have some effect on their words or actions as member. And the whole point of our system is that we know most politicians, most people don't like being accused of doing anything wrong, don't think of themselves as bad people. And so when, from time to time, they do receive something, if they do, they're not going to say, I am now doing X, Y, Z because of the gift. They might think it's wholly coincidental. But the whole point of the rules is, well, let's have a world in which we all know what those benefits are, and then we can make our own determination as to whether you have acted because of this or that or the other. And then you can say, no, I haven't, and I can say, I think you might have, and it falls within the domain of political contestation and debate, which is the essence of politics. But the issue here has always been the idea that there are interests which have been concealed. Now, Farage says an interest weren't concealed, they were withheld because they never needed to be divulged in the first instance. And I suppose the question there is, well, does that really work? Does it work with the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner, but also do people accept it as being reasonable? The point is that if we don't know that the interests exist, then it's difficult / it's impossible to make that determination. And so therein lies what I think the public interest of this is. This is a man who wants to be Prime Minister, who therefore can reasonably expect to face general scrutiny, just as Keir Starmer did, just as Andy Burnham no doubt will now. And so I suppose, in that way it's reasonably straightforward. If you are being secretly funded by people, or people have previously given you monies that weren't visible to the public, the job of journalism from time to time is to remedy that.
In response to the George Cottrell investigation, Nigel Farage said that he was the victim of an establishment hit job and that he's done nothing wrong, and he specifically denied that any benefits he received from George Cottrell required registration. He added, "I followed the rules and I am now considering legal action against the Sunday Times. It's now clear the establishment will stop at nothing to hurt reform. We want to smash their cosy consensus." Robert Jenrick, Reform UK's Treasury spokesman, said Mr Cottrell is an old friend of Nigel Farage's and has no formal role within Reform. George Cottrell, for his part, denies he expected any benefit from his relationship with Farage. It was the George Cottrell allegations that proved to be the tipping point for Nigel Farage, but questions around his finances had been swirling for months.
When I did my documentary on Nigel Farage, I tried to link the source of his finances. In the end, we didn't include it in the documentary because it was just too complicated.
Fraser Nelson is a columnist for The Times who's been delving into Farage's finances. He also presented a documentary on reform for Channel 4 last year.
There were, broadly speaking, 3 parts to Farage Inc., if you want to call it that. That is media, property and crypto. And it was quite clear that he was building a very successful business. Now, it was never clear to me where he got the money. And earlier on this year, it turns out to be quite a small story in the Times, on page 3 or something. Nigel Farage emerges as a strategic investor in Stack BTC, a small crypto company chaired by Kwasi Kwarteng. Now, to me, what jumped out was the fact that he had £225,000 to speculate on a very kind of risky crypto investment. Now, where on earth, I wondered, where he got that amount of money from, given that in 2017 he gave an interview saying that the Brexit has left him broke. He's saying he's separated and skint. I just couldn't work it out. We know he'd been given £1 million for appearing on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, but £1 million doesn't give you enough money to spend 200 grand on Kwasi Kwarteng's crypto company. So all of these things never made sense until the Guardian newspaper revealed that Christopher Harborne had given this £5 million tax-free, importantly, gift to Nigel Farage that would have been transformative. But also, we are seeing this level of money changing hands that we've never seen before in our democracy. A £5 million gift, nothing remotely like this has ever happened, and people are entitled to ask why. And of course, this matters democratically because you have to ask, what does he want in return? Was it really a gift?
And we should say that Christopher Harborne, when he's been asked about that £5 million gift, has insisted that he wasn't expecting anything in return apart from ensuring Farage's safety. And he said he'd given the money to Farage because of his great admiration for the decades of work that he'd done to achieve Brexit.
If you look at Farage's policies, you'll find, lo and behold, there's a Crypto and Finance Act, which he would do, he says, on day one of becoming Prime Minister, he would order the Treasury to stop developing a rival to Bitcoin. The point here is, we are living in unprecedented times. If the next Prime Minister arrives and all of a sudden starts to pass laws benefiting the crypto dealers, then we have to ask why that's happening. Now, when I wrote my very long 2,500 word essay on this for the Times, I spent weeks on that and it got almost no reaction. People were joking about how it was, too dense. Perhaps I didn't write it as well as I could have done, I don't know. But I believed it was important because I had seen in the American election a wall of crypto money flood into those elections. Crypto money's coming behind candidate after candidate. All of a sudden they're flush with cash. In the same way that Reform is flush with cash. It's raising far more than any other political party because it's getting it from crypto. The crypto money is off the scale. I saw it transform American politics, and I could see it attempting to transform British politics, hiding in plain sight, because Farage is there, presenting himself as a crypto investor.
Crypto in politics does feel very new. We should say, though, Nigel Farage has denied any wrongdoing in relation to not declaring that £5 million gift from Christopher Harborne. He said, and I quote, "The rules are very clear. There is no obligation to declare something that is an unconditional, non-political, personal gift." Now, that is actually the subject of an inquiry by the Parliamentary Standards investigation, which has been underway for a while now. What happens to that inquiry and any new inquiry which was about to be launched about George Cottrell? What happens to those investigations by Parliament?
So we'd heard this morning that the interview scheduled for today was postponed until September.
So today he would have been interviewed by the Parliamentary Standards.
That's our understanding.
Investigators.
But later today they said, no, let's do it after the summer. And then we hear about his press conference. Now, these investigations are paused for the by-election, but of course they'll be resuming if he is re-elected. And then, of course, if they find against him, there could be a recall petition and yet another by-election. So there's poor souls who might have to be forced into 3 elections for Nigel Farage in the space of 3 years. So we've got another inequality here. Nigel Farage doesn't need to hold a by-election. This won't achieve anything, I don't think. All he's doing is using his voters as pawns, as extras in a great kind of political drama, mobilising them out of their houses to go into the polling booths because he's angry at journalists asking him questions. Now, I have always been very critical of politicians who do this for reasons of their own ego, whether it's Conservatives like Nadine Dorries who held the by-election because she didn't get into the House of Lords, or other ones who wanted to leave Parliament a year early to take a job and force people into by-elections, as if this power of forcing everybody out of their houses and into the voting booths is something you do as a rhetorical flourish.
Nigel Farage is obviously framing this as him going to the people. He doesn't trust the establishment. He thinks everyone else is trying to bring him down, but the people will back him. He's trying to show that he's leaning into democracy, if anything. What do you think the game plan is here? Because, one of the worries would have been if the investigation found against him, there would be a recall and he would face a by-election. That's not something people normally welcome. Do you think he's very confident he'll win?
Yes, and he should be because he will win. Clacton is the most reformy part of the UK. Now, what he's seeking to do here is quite simple. He will claim that he has been exonerated by his constituents. My constituents, they voted for me again, I had a by-election, therefore all of these questions you're asking me about impropriety were answered in the by-election. So here he's trying to use the by-election almost as a form of clemency. Of course, it's not that, and it's not going to stop people having reservations about how reform is financed and how Farage behaves.
We don't know how that contest will work out, but there are rumours already doing the rounds in Westminster this afternoon that all the other parties might just refuse to field a candidate, which would make the whole exercise utterly pointless. Ed Davey, the leader of the Lib Dems, has said they don't want to give oxygen to Farage's vanity project. So there is a scenario where he stands alone and the whole thing looks a bit ridiculous. But he does get back to Parliament and these standards inquiries are relaunched. Is there a world in which he could say, but hang on, now you're asking questions about the funding I got in the year before I got into Parliament the last time round? Presumably, he'll want to do anything he can to deflect from this. How seriously will those investigations still be taken if he comes back into Parliament in the autumn?
The parliamentary standards officials are quasi-judicial. They will not really be moved by this either way. They've got a simple question to answer. Given that the rules tell MPs to disclose anything that others may see to be influential, should Nigel Farage have disclosed? The then decision they've got to make is whether is this going to be a serious breach or a moderate breach. If it's a serious one, that opens the door to a by-election. But I don't think this process will be preempted or the wind taken out of its sails by this by-election. To me, I think all of this risks getting away from the real point, which is who is funding our politics and why. And whether you should have declared it or not, the fact that the money is there, the financial relationships are there, the fact that Farage is linked to people who've had criminal convictions.
Yeah.
I mean, George Cottrell served 8 months in a federal penitentiary and was there at his right hand. We've got the leader of Reform in Wales, who's currently in prison for having been caught taking Russian bribes. We've got Ben Dello, who was also convicted of some money laundering regulation, given a pardon by Trump, but he's now back living in Britain and only recently was signed up as a donor to Reform. It almost seems as if Reform UK is attracting people who have been pushed to the fringes by dint of criminal conviction or something else, and they're all getting in line behind Reform. And sometimes, to me, this doesn't look like a populist revolt. It looks like a new establishment forming, getting ready to take power via populism.
And talking of that, I mean, how will this play out with Reform's core voters? You know, when they see the support of convicted criminals, when they see all the money that is coming in for a politician who's supposed to be a man of the people, does that change their image of him?
No, it doesn't. There are now studies showing this kind of phenomenon, that the core supporters double down. Donald Trump used to joke that he could step outside and shoot somebody dead and still wouldn't lose any opinion poll support. That's what political tribalism does. It means people aren't inclined to see all criticism as partisan attacks. But that is the core supporters. Now, there is a quote attributed to Margaret Thatcher: "It doesn't matter how much people who don't vote for you don't like you." That isn't entirely true, because if people who don't vote for Reform come to see Reform as a racist party, as polls show about 40% do, if they come to see it as a real and present threat to our democracy, then this will trigger anti-Reform tactical voting. We've seen this in by-election after by-election, and that means Labour voting Tory, Tory voting Labour, simply to stop Reform. So it does matter, I think. Even if Reform's base is absolutely galvanised by this, you can see it on social media. We don't care, we're voting for him through thick or thin. At the next election, if Reform is still seen to be in contention for power, then we can see a situation where people will vote for whoever is most likely to stop Reform. Now, that will really put the kibosh under Reform. It also means, by the way, that the Conservatives are under pressure to rule out any sort of coalition with them. Kemi Bainlich did that when she was at the Times CEO Summit a few weeks ago. She was saying she's going to be standing on a Labour out, stop Reform ticket. Now, she does that because she wants maximum votes. That's what politicians do. But she's figuring that Reform is becoming so toxic that she will get left-wing votes, because left-wingers will vote Conservative if they think the Conservatives are most likely to stop Reform. So this toxification, if you like, can make your core supporters doubly, trebly determined to vote for you, but it can also mean an anti-Reform coalition is formed in Britain. And that makes a mockery of opinion polls. Opinion polls ask who you personally support. But that is becoming a very different question to who you're going to vote for. We saw this in Wales. Reform were ahead in the polls, and then you ended up with Labour and Tory voting for Plaid Cymru, because Plaid would plausibly stop Reform.
Yeah.
So this behaviour from Nigel Farage will save him in Clacton, but I think it will make it even less likely that he forms the next government. He still is the bookmaker's favourite to succeed, Andy Burnham, but I would now bet against that in the way that I wouldn't have done a year ago.
That was the Times columnist, Fraser Nelson. And before that, you heard from the Sunday Times Insight editor, Gabriel Pogrund. There's more coverage on thetimes.com, and you can listen to the Sunday Times investigation podcast series, Posh George, the criminal behind Farage, wherever you get your podcasts, and episode 3 is dropping tomorrow. The producers today were Sophie McNulty and Harry Stott. The executive producer was Edward Drummond. Sound design and theme composition were by Mauro Lassetto. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.